Bashar al-Assad, Rise, Rule, and the Fall of a Dynasty. Part 1. Early Life, Family Background, and Education. Bashar al-Assad was born on September 11, 1965, in the historic city of Damascus, the capital of Syria. His birth marked an era of transformation for his family, which was rapidly ascending to prominence in Syrian politics. Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, would go on to become one of the most enduring and controversial figures in modern Middle Eastern history, ruling Syria with an iron grip for nearly 3 decades. Bashar was the second son and third child of Hafez and his wife, Anisa Makhlouf, who came from a well-known Alawite family. The Alawites, a minority sect within Islam, had historically been marginalized in Syria, but would find themselves at the center of power under Hafez's leadership. The Assad family's rise to prominence was nothing short of extraordinary. Hafez's father, Ali Suleiman al-Assad, had been a modest farmer in the rural village of Kardaha, nestled in the mountains of Latakia Governorate. The family's original surname, Wash, meaning savage in Arabic, was changed to al-Assad, meaning the lion, in 1927 by Ali Suleiman, signaling a desire to elevate the family's status and reflect their aspirations for influence. This symbolic gesture foreshadowed the family's determination to overcome societal barriers and achieve political dominance in a deeply stratified Syrian society. Hafez al-Assad's own rise to power was marked by strategic brilliance and ruthless determination. Born into poverty, he joined the Ba'ath Party as a young man, captivated by its promises of Arab nationalism, socialism, and the empowerment of marginalized groups. Hafez's military career flourished, and he eventually orchestrated a coup in 1970, known as the Corrective Movement, which solidified his control over Syria. From then on, he transformed the country into a tightly controlled police state, centralizing authority within the Assad family and their loyal Alawite allies. As a child, Bashar al-Assad grew up in this politically charged and authoritarian environment. Unlike his older brother Bassel, who was groomed for leadership from an early age, Bashar showed little interest in politics or military affairs. He was described by family members and acquaintances as a quiet and reserved child, more inclined toward books and academic pursuits than the rough and tumble world of power and strategy that defined his father's rule. This difference in temperament set him apart from his siblings and contributed to the perception that he was unsuited for a life in politics. Bashar's childhood was shaped by the privileges and pressures of being part of Syria's first family. The Assads lived in a secluded and heavily guarded compound in Damascus, shielded from the public but constantly under the watchful eyes of security personnel and advisors. The family's wealth and influence provided Bashar with access to the best education available. He attended the Arab-French Al-Hurriya school in Damascus, a prestigious institution that catered to the country's elite. There he received a bilingual education, excelling in both Arabic and French, and was introduced to a rigorous academic curriculum that emphasized discipline and intellectual growth. Despite his reserved nature, Bashar was a diligent student who excelled in his studies, particularly in the sciences. Teachers and classmates often remarked on his methodical approach to problem solving and his keen interest in understanding the mechanics of the world around him. His quiet demeanor belied a sharp intellect and a capacity for intense focus, traits that would later serve him in his medical career. In 1982, Bashar graduated from high school and enrolled in the medical program at Damascus University. His decision to pursue medicine was a departure from the paths taken by other members of his family, who were more deeply entrenched in the military and political spheres. For Bashar, the study of medicine offered an opportunity to carve out an identity distinct from his father and brothers. It also reflected his natural curiosity and desire to contribute to society in a meaningful way. During his years at Damascus University, Bashar's personality began to take shape. He was known among his peers as polite, introspective, and somewhat introverted. Unlike his older brother Bassel, who exuded confidence and charisma, Bashar preferred to stay in the background, avoiding the limelight and focusing on his academic work. This contrast between the two brothers became increasingly apparent as Bassel rose to prominence as Hafez's chosen heir, while Bashar quietly pursued his studies. In 1988, after completing his medical degree, Bashar began working as an army doctor at the Tishrin Military Hospital on the outskirts of Damascus. This position allowed him to gain practical experience while serving the military establishment, a key pillar of the Assad regime. Bashar's work at the hospital earned him the respect of colleagues who appreciated his dedication and professionalism. However, his role remained largely apolitical, and he continued to distance himself from the power struggles and political machinations that defined his family's world. In 1992, Bashar decided to specialize in ophthalmology, a field that combined his interest in science with his desire to help others. He moved to London to pursue postgraduate training at the Western Eye Hospital, one of the leading institutions in the field. This period marked a significant turning point in Bashar's life, as it exposed him to a vastly different culture and way of life. In London, he experienced a level of freedom and anonymity that was impossible in Syria. Colleagues and acquaintances in London described him as approachable, humble, and eager to learn, earning him the nickname the geeky IT guy due to his fascination with technology. While Bashar was building a life for himself in London, his older brother Bassel was preparing to inherit their father's mantle. Bassel was charismatic, ambitious, and deeply involved in military and political affairs, embodying the qualities Hafez believed were necessary to lead Syria. His public image was carefully cultivated through state propaganda, which presented him as the ideal successor to Hafez's legacy. However, the family's carefully laid plans were shattered on January 21, 1994, when Bassel died in a car accident while driving to Damascus International Airport. His sudden and tragic death sent shockwaves through the Assad family and the country as a whole. For Hafez, the loss of his chosen heir was a devastating blow, but it also created a vacuum that needed to be filled. Reluctantly, Hafez turned to Bashar, the unassuming son who had shown little interest in politics or power. The decision to groom Bashar as the new heir apparent marked a dramatic shift in his life's trajectory. Overnight, he was thrust into the spotlight and tasked with preparing for a role he had never sought. For Bashar, this meant abandoning his medical career and returning to Syria to undergo intensive training in governance, military strategy, and political leadership. It was the beginning of a journey that would transform him from a quiet doctor into one of the most controversial leaders of the 21st century. Part 2, the death of Bassel and Bashar's reluctant rise as heir apparent. The untimely death of Bashar al-Assad on January 20, 1994, was a pivotal moment in the Assad family's history, one that would alter Bashar al-Assad's life forever. Bassel, the eldest son of Hafez al-Assad, had been groomed meticulously as the heir to the Syrian presidency. Charismatic, assertive, and deeply entrenched in military and political affairs, Bassel embodied the qualities Hafez believed necessary for a leader to maintain control over Syria's complex and often volatile political landscape. His death in a car accident near Damascus International Airport sent shockwaves throughout Syria, creating an immediate and pressing question: who would succeed Hafez? For the Assad family, Bassel's death was not only a personal tragedy, but a political crisis. Hafez al-Assad's rule had been marked by a highly personalized system of governance, where power was concentrated within a tight-knit circle of family members and loyalists. Bassel had been integral to this structure, serving as a bridge between Hafez and the military elite, as well as a symbol of continuity for the Assad dynasty. With Bassel gone, the succession plan that had been years in the making was suddenly upended. In the wake of Bassel's death, Hafez turned to his second son, Bashar, as the new heir apparent. This decision came as a surprise to many, given Bashar's lack of political or military experience and his markedly different personality. Unlike Bassel, who had been outgoing, commanding, and deeply involved in state affairs, Bashar was quiet, reserved, and academically inclined. At the time of Bassel's death, Bashar was living in London, pursuing a postgraduate specialization in ophthalmology. His life revolved around his medical career, far removed from the high-stakes world of Syrian politics. The transition from doctor to heir apparent was abrupt and dramatic for Bashar. Within weeks of Bassel's death, he was summoned back to Syria to begin the process of preparing for leadership. This preparation was not merely symbolic, it required a complete transformation of Bashar's public image, skills, and mindset. Under the guidance of his father and senior members of the Ba'ath Party, Bashar embarked on a rigorous and highly controlled training regimen designed to mold him into a leader capable of maintaining the Assad family's grip on power. One of the first steps in this transformation was military training. In 1994, Bashar enrolled at the Homs Military Academy, one of Syria's premier institutions for officer training. Over the next few years, he rose rapidly through the ranks, earning promotions that were more reflective of his political role than his actual military expertise. By 1999, he had been promoted to colonel in the elite Syrian Republican Guard, a position that underscored his growing prominence within the military establishment. This rapid ascent was carefully orchestrated by Hafez, who recognized the importance of securing the loyalty of the armed forces for Bashar's eventual succession. Alongside his military training, Bashar was also introduced to the inner workings of the Syrian government. Under the supervision of trusted advisors, he was given increasing responsibilities within the Ba'ath Party and the state apparatus. This included overseeing the handling of citizen complaints and leading a high-profile campaign against corruption. These roles served a dual purpose. They allowed Bashar to gain experience in governance while also building his public image as a reformer and problem solver. State media began to present him as the hope of the masses, a modern and approachable leader who could carry Syria into the 21st century. Despite these efforts, Bashar's transition to heir apparent was not without challenges. Within the Assad regime, there were those who questioned his suitability for leadership, particularly in comparison to his late brother. Bassel had commanded respect and loyalty among the military elite and Ba'athist old guard, many of whom viewed Bashar's academic and reserved demeanor as a liability. To address these concerns, Hafez undertook a series of purges within the military and government, removing individuals who were perceived as potential threats to Bashar's position. In their place, Hafez installed loyalists who were committed to ensuring a smooth transfer of power. The most significant of these changes occurred within the military hierarchy. High-ranking officers who had been close to Bassel were retired or reassigned, and younger officers with ties to Bashar were promoted to key positions. This reshuffling of the military leadership was critical in consolidating Bashar's authority and ensuring that he would have the support of the armed forces when the time came to assume power. Among those tasked with overseeing this process was General Bajat Suleiman, a senior officer in the defense companies and one of Hafez's most trusted allies. Suleiman played a key role in managing Bashar's transition, acting as both mentor and enforcer. As Bashar's role within the regime expanded, so too did the public's awareness of him. State propaganda worked tirelessly to elevate his profile, presenting him as a capable and forward-thinking leader who was deeply committed to the welfare of the Syrian people. This campaign was particularly focused on portraying Bashar as a modernizer, a leader who embraced technological innovation and sought to bring Syria into the digital age. To this end, he was appointed president of the Syrian Computer Society, a position that allowed him to advocate for the introduction of the internet in Syria. This initiative, while limited in scope, bolstered Bashar's image as a progressive figure and won him the support of younger Syrians and technocrats. However, Bashar's rise to prominence also highlighted the complexities and contradictions of the Assad regime. While he was presented as a reformer, his ascent was facilitated by the same authoritarian structures that had defined his father's rule. The purges, propaganda, and manipulation of state institutions that enabled Bashar's transition were emblematic of the regime's reliance on coercion and control. Moreover, his image as a modernizer was at odds with the realities of Syria's deeply entrenched political and economic inequalities, which were exacerbated by the regime's policies. By the late 1990s, Bashar had emerged as the undisputed heir to the Syrian presidency. His transformation from a quiet ophthalmologist to a prominent political figure was complete. but questions remained about his ability to lead. While Hafez al-Assad had succeeded in positioning his son as the future of Syria, the true test of Bashar's leadership would come only after his father's death. For now, he stood in the shadow of Hafez, preparing for a role that would define the next chapter of his life and the future of Syria. Part 3. Ascension to the Presidency and the Promise of Reform, 2000–2001. The death of Hafez al-Assad on June 10, 2000, marked the end of an era in Syrian politics. Hafez had ruled Syria for nearly 3 decades, transforming the country into a tightly controlled police state dominated by the Ba'ath Party and his family's inner circle. His passing left a vacuum that needed to be filled quickly to maintain stability. For Bashar al-Assad, who had spent the previous 6 years preparing for this moment, it was both an opportunity and a daunting challenge. Bashar's path to the presidency was facilitated by swift legal and political maneuvers. At the time of Hafez's death, Syria's constitution stipulated that the president must be at least 40 years old. Bashar, at 34, was not eligible. However, the Ba'ath Party-dominated parliament wasted no time in amending the constitution, lowering the minimum age requirement to match Bashar's age. This move was a clear demonstration of the regime's determination to ensure a smooth transition of power within the Assad family. On July 10, 2000, a presidential referendum was held, with Bashar as the sole candidate. The results, as announced by the state, showed overwhelming support. 97.29% of voters approved his presidency. While the process was widely regarded as a sham, it served its purpose in legitimizing Bashar's leadership in the eyes of the regime and its supporters. On July 17, 2000, Bashar was sworn in as the 19th president of Syria, inheriting not only his father's office, but also the immense burden of maintaining the fragile balance of power that had defined Hafez's rule. From the outset, Bashar's presidency was framed as a new beginning for Syria. State propaganda portrayed him as a modernizer and reformer, a leader who would address the grievances of ordinary Syrians while preserving the stability of the regime. Bashar himself seemed to embrace this narrative. In his inaugural speech, he spoke of the need for transparency, accountability, and economic modernization. He promised to combat corruption, promote technological development, and create a more open and inclusive political environment. These pledges resonated with many Syrians who were eager for change after decades of repression and stagnation under Hafez. The early months of Bashar's presidency were marked by a sense of cautious optimism. This period, later dubbed the Damascus Spring, saw a flowering of political and cultural activity. Intellectuals, activists, and dissidents began to push for greater freedoms, organizing forums and publishing manifestos that called for democratic reforms. Prominent figures like Riyad Seif and Michel Kilo emerged as leading voices in this movement, advocating for an end to the state of emergency that had been in place since 1963, as well as the release of political prisoners and the establishment of a multi-party system. In response, Bashar made several gestures that seemed to signal his willingness to embrace reform. He ordered the closure of the notorious Meza prison, a symbol of the regime's repression, and granted amnesty to hundreds of political prisoners, including members of the banned Muslim Brotherhood. He also permitted the formation of independent discussion forums, where citizens could debate issues ranging from economic policy to human rights. These developments were widely celebrated as evidence of a new, more progressive era in Syrian politics. Bashar's focus on modernization extended beyond the political sphere. He launched initiatives to improve Syria's technological infrastructure, including efforts to expand internet access and promote digital literacy. As president of the Syrian Computer Society, he had already championed the introduction of the internet in Syria, albeit under strict government control. Now, as head of state, he sought to position Syria as a hub for technological innovation in the region. These efforts won him praise from young Syrians and urban professionals who saw him as a forward-thinking leader. However, the optimism of the Damascus Spring was short-lived. By late 2001, it had become clear that Bashar's promises of reform were largely rhetorical. The regime's underlying structures of power remained intact, and any challenges to its authority were swiftly suppressed. The same security apparatus that had been central to Hafez's rule continued to operate with impunity, monitoring dissidents, censoring media, and cracking down on opposition. Bashar's reluctance or inability to deliver meaningful change was driven by several factors. First, he faced significant resistance from the entrenched elite within the Ba'ath Party and the military, many of whom viewed reform as a threat to their privileges. These individuals, often referred to as the Old Guard, wielded considerable influence and were deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. Second, Bashar himself was a product of the system he had inherited. While he spoke the language of reform, his actions revealed a commitment to preserving the authoritarian foundations of the Assad regime. The turning point came in 2001, when the regime launched a series of crackdowns that effectively ended the Damascus Spring. Leading intellectuals and activists were arrested, discussion forums were shut down, and censorship was tightened. The state of emergency remained in place, and promises of political reform were quietly abandoned. These actions sent a clear message. While limited expressions of dissent might be tolerated, any attempts to challenge the regime's authority would be met with force. By the end of his first year in office, Bashar had established himself as a leader who was both shaped by and beholden to the system he presided over. The hopes of the Damascus Spring had given way to a new reality. Under Bashar al-Assad, Syria would remain an authoritarian state, albeit one with a modernized facade. For many Syrians, this realization was a bitter disappointment, marking the beginning of a long and tumultuous chapter in the country's history. Part 4. Consolidation of Power and the Cracks Beneath the Surface, 2002-2005. By 2002, Bashar al-Assad had largely cemented his position as Syria's president. The public image cultivated in the early years of his presidency, a soft-spoken, reform-minded leader with a vision for modernization, remained prominent in state propaganda. However, beneath this polished veneer, the reality of Bashar's rule was beginning to take shape, revealing a leader deeply entrenched in the authoritarian structures inherited from his father. The end of the Damascus Spring. The optimism of the Damascus Spring had dissipated entirely by 2002. The wave of arrests targeting intellectuals, activists, and opposition figures continued to expand. Among the high-profile figures detained were Riyad Seif and Arif Dalila, who had dared to call for genuine democratic reforms and economic transparency. Their imprisonment served as a stark reminder that dissent would not be tolerated under Bashar's rule. The forums and discussion groups that had briefly flourished were shuttered, their participants silenced through intimidation and imprisonment. While Bashar had initially appeared willing to allow limited freedoms, it became evident that his tolerance for political openness had strict boundaries. The regime justified its actions by claiming that the demands for reform threatened national unity and stability, framing dissent as a danger to the state. This narrative resonated with many within the Ba'athist Old Guard, who remained deeply suspicious of any efforts to loosen the regime's grip on power. Economic liberalization and growing inequalities. One of the hallmarks of Bashar's early presidency was his emphasis on economic reform. Syria's economy, long dominated by state control and crony capitalism, was in dire need of modernization. Bashar introduced a series of economic liberalization policies aimed at encouraging private investment, reducing government subsidies, and integrating Syria into the global market. These measures were accompanied by high-profile efforts to attract foreign investment, with the regime portraying Syria as a country open for business. However, the benefits of these reforms were unevenly distributed. While a small elite of business leaders, many of whom were tied to the Assad family, reaped substantial rewards, the majority of Syrians saw little improvement in their living standards. Rural communities, in particular, were hit hard by the reduction of subsidies on basic goods, while urban working-class neighborhoods struggled with rising unemployment and inflation. The growing economic disparity fueled resentment among ordinary Syrians, many of whom viewed Bashar's reforms as a betrayal of the Ba'ath Party's socialist principles. The most glaring symbol of this inequality was the rise of Bashar's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who emerged as one of the country's wealthiest and most powerful businessmen. Through his control of key industries, including telecommunications and banking, Makhlouf became a central figure in Syria's economy, representing the close ties between political power and economic privilege. His dominance fueled widespread perceptions of corruption, further eroding the regime's legitimacy among the populace. The Syrian occupation of Lebanon and the Cedar Revolution. A significant aspect of Bashar's presidency during this period was Syria's continued occupation of Lebanon, a legacy of Hafez al-Assad's intervention in the Lebanese civil war in the 1970s. By the early 2000s, Syria maintained a strong military and political presence in Lebanon, with tens of thousands of troops stationed in the country and close ties to key Lebanese political factions, including Hezbollah. However, Syria's dominance in Lebanon began to face increasing opposition, both domestically and internationally. The assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri on February 14, 2005, marked a turning point. Hariri, a prominent critic of Syria's role in Lebanon, was killed in a massive truck bomb explosion in Beirut that also claimed the lives of 21 others. The attack was widely blamed on the Syrian regime, with many accusing Bashar of orchestrating the killing to eliminate a political rival and intimidate the Lebanese opposition. The assassination sparked widespread outrage in Lebanon, culminating in the Cedar Revolution, a mass protest movement demanding an end to Syrian occupation. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese citizens, including Muslims and Christians, took to the streets of Beirut, calling for the withdrawal of Syrian troops. The international community, led by the United States and France, also exerted pressure on Syria, adopting United Nations Security Council Resolution 1559, which called for the complete withdrawal of foreign forces from Lebanon. Faced with mounting protests and international isolation, Bashar was forced to make a difficult decision. On March 5, 2005, he announced that Syrian troops would begin withdrawing from Lebanon. By the end of April, the withdrawal was complete, ending nearly 30 years of Syrian military presence in Lebanon. While the decision was framed as a strategic retreat, it was widely viewed as a significant defeat for Bashar, undermining his image as a strong and decisive leader. Internal challenges and sectarian tensions. The withdrawal from Lebanon was not the only challenge Bashar faced during this period. Within Syria, discontent was growing among various segments of society. The economic reforms had alienated rural communities and urban workers, while the regime's heavy-handed suppression of dissent had silenced intellectuals and activists. Even within the Ba'ath Party, there were rumblings of dissatisfaction, particularly among members of the old guard, who resented Bashar's efforts to sideline them in favor of younger loyalists. Sectarian tensions also simmered beneath the surface. While the Assad regime portrayed itself as a secular government committed to protecting minorities, its power base remained heavily reliant on the Alawite community. This reliance exacerbated feelings of exclusion among Syria's Sunni majority, as well as other minority groups such as the Kurds and Druze. The regime's policies of favoritism and patronage deepened these divisions, creating a sense of inequality that would later play a significant role in the country's descent into conflict. A fragile consolidation. By 2005, Bashar had managed to consolidate his power to a significant extent. Through a combination of propaganda, patronage, and repression, he had neutralized most of his political opponents and secured the loyalty of key institutions, including the military and intelligence services. However, the foundations of his rule were far from secure. The economic and political reforms he had promised at the start of his presidency had largely failed to materialize, leaving many Syrians disillusioned and frustrated. The loss of Lebanon, coupled with growing domestic discontent, revealed the fragility of Bashar's position, setting the stage for the challenges that would come to define the next phase of his presidency. Part 5. The Arab Spring and the Beginnings of the Syrian Uprising, 2011. The year 2011 was a watershed moment for the Arab world, as a wave of protests and revolutions swept across the region in what came to be known as the Arab Spring. From Tunisia to Egypt and Libya to Yemen, millions of people took to the streets to demand greater political freedoms, economic opportunities, and an end to decades of autocratic rule. In Syria, where Bashar al-Assad had ruled for over a decade, the seeds of unrest were already present, rooted in widespread corruption, economic inequality, and political repression. The events of the Arab Spring acted as a catalyst, transforming simmering discontent into a full-blown uprising. The early protests. The Syrian uprising began modestly in January 2011, with small-scale protests calling for political reforms and greater freedoms. The first significant demonstration occurred on March 6 in the southern city of Daraya, where a group of school children was arrested and tortured for writing anti-regime graffiti. The brutality of the authorities' response, meting out harsh punishments on minors, ignited outrage among the local population. This outrage culminated in widespread protests in Dara, with demonstrators demanding the release of the children and an end to government repression. As the protests in Dara gained momentum, similar demonstrations began erupting in other parts of the country, including Damascus, Homs, and Hama. Initially, the demands of the protesters were moderate: the lifting of the decades-long state of emergency, the release of political prisoners, and reforms to address corruption and inequality. However, the regime's heavy-handed response, which included the use of live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators, escalated tensions and fueled anger across the nation. Bashar's response: a mix of concessions and crackdowns. Faced with the growing unrest, Bashar al-Assad appeared to adopt a dual strategy, offering limited concessions while simultaneously cracking down on dissent. In a televised speech on March 30, 2011, he acknowledged the grievances of the protesters, but framed the uprising as part of a foreign conspiracy aimed at destabilizing Syria. This narrative, which blamed the unrest on external actors and saboteurs, became a cornerstone of the regime's propaganda throughout the conflict. As part of his efforts to placate the protesters, Bashar announced a series of reforms, including plans to lift the state of emergency, increase public sector wages, and allow for greater political participation. However, these promises were widely viewed as insincere, particularly given the regime's continued use of violence against demonstrators. In April 2011, the government launched a military crackdown in Dara, deploying tanks and troops to quell the protests. This operation resulted in hundreds of deaths and marked the beginning of a pattern of brutal repression that would define the regime's response to the uprising. Escalation and militarization. As the regime's violence escalated, so too did the resolve of the protesters. What had begun as a largely peaceful movement began to take on a more militant character. By mid-2011, some opposition groups had begun to arm themselves in self-defense, leading to clashes with government forces. The Free Syrian Army (FSA), a coalition of defected military personnel and civilian volunteers, was formed in July 2011 with the goal of overthrowing the Assad regime. This marked the start of the militarization of the Syrian uprising, a development that would have profound consequences for the trajectory of the conflict. The regime's response to this growing challenge was uncompromising. Security forces, bolstered by pro-Assad militias known as the Shabiham, carried out widespread arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Entire neighborhoods were besieged, with residents subjected to indiscriminate shelling and collective punishment. Human rights organizations documented numerous cases of civilians being detained and tortured in secret prisons, often for nothing more than participating in protests or expressing anti-regime sentiments. The role of sectarianism. While the early protests were largely non-sectarian, the regime's response exacerbated existing sectarian tensions within Syrian society. The Assad family and many of the regime's key figures hailed from the Alawite sect, a minority group that constituted roughly 10% of Syria's population. By contrast, the majority of the protesters were Sunni Muslims, who made up around 70% of the population. The regime portrayed the uprising as a Sunni-led conspiracy to overthrow the Alawites and other minority groups, a narrative designed to rally the Alawite community and other minorities, such as Christians and Druze, to its side. This sectarian framing of the conflict further polarized Syrian society, with devastating consequences. In some areas, Alawite militias carried out attacks on Sunni communities, while Sunni insurgents targeted Alawite-dominated areas. These acts of violence deepened the divisions between Syria's communities, turning a political uprising into an increasingly sectarian conflict. International reactions. The international community's response to the Syrian uprising was mixed. Western countries, including the United States and members of the European Union, condemned the Assad regime's use of violence and called for political reforms. In May 2011, the United States imposed targeted sanctions on Bashar al-Assad and several senior officials, while the European Union followed suit with similar measures. These sanctions were intended to pressure the regime into ending its crackdown and engaging in dialogue with the opposition. At the same time, regional actors were divided in their approach. While countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia expressed support for the protesters and provided assistance to opposition groups, others, including Iran and Russia, stood firmly behind the Assad regime. Iran viewed the survival of the Assad government as critical to maintaining its influence in the region, while Russia saw Syria as a key ally and a bulwark against Western intervention in the Middle East. Both countries provided the regime with financial, military, and political support, helping to bolster its position despite growing international isolation. The beginning of the Syrian civil war. By the end of 2011, the Syrian uprising had evolved into a full-scale civil war. The regime's brutal repression and the increasing militarization of the opposition created a cycle of violence that spiraled out of control. What had begun as a movement for political reform had become a battle for the survival of the Assad regime, with profound implications for Syria and the wider region. For Bashar al-Assad, the events of 2011 marked a turning point in his presidency. The promise of reform that had characterized the early years of his rule was now a distant memory, replaced by a narrative of resistance against foreign conspiracies and internal enemies. As Syria descended into chaos, Bashar's grip on power appeared increasingly precarious, setting the stage for one of the most devastating conflicts of the 21st century. Part 6, The Descent into Civil War and the Assad Regime's Survival Strategies, 2012-2013. By the beginning of 2012, Syria was engulfed in a brutal and escalating civil war. What had started as a popular uprising against the authoritarian rule of Bashar al-Assad had spiraled into a conflict characterized by widespread violence, sectarian divisions, and increasing external interference. For Bashar, the challenges to his regime were mounting, but his response was as resolute as it was ruthless. Determined to maintain his grip on power, he employed a combination of military force, propaganda, and alliances to weather the storm. The militarization of the conflict. As protests turned into armed resistance, the Assad regime launched an all-out military campaign to crush the opposition. The Free Syrian Army, FSA, composed of defectors from the Syrian military and civilian volunteers, emerged as a key player in the armed struggle against the regime. Armed clashes between government forces and opposition groups became commonplace, with cities like Homs, Hama, and Aleppo turning into battlegrounds. The regime's military strategy was marked by its brutality. Civilian populations in opposition-held areas bore the brunt of the government's crackdown. Entire neighborhoods were bombarded with heavy artillery, tanks, and airstrikes. The siege of Homs in early 2012 became emblematic of the regime's approach. For weeks, government forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies and indiscriminately shelling residential areas. Hundreds of civilians were killed, and thousands more were displaced, creating a humanitarian crisis. In addition to conventional military tactics, the regime relied on pro-Assad militias known as the Shabiha. These paramilitary groups, drawn primarily from the Alawite community, carried out atrocities against Sunni-majority areas, including massacres, kidnappings, and torture. Their actions further fueled sectarian tensions and deepened the divide between Syria's communities. The role of propaganda. While the regime waged war on the ground, it also fought a parallel battle in the realm of propaganda. State media portrayed the opposition as terrorists and foreign agents, accusing them of plotting to destabilize Syria in collusion with Western powers and Gulf states. This narrative sought to delegitimize the uprising and rally support for the regime, particularly among minority communities and loyalists. Bashar al-Assad himself played a key role in shaping this narrative. In public speeches and interviews, he characterized the conflict as a fight between the forces of stability and chaos. He claimed that his government was the last line of defense against extremist groups like al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, which began to gain prominence during this period. This framing resonated with segments of the population that feared the alternative to Assad's rule would be a collapse into anarchy or sectarian violence. International involvement. The international dimension of the Syrian conflict became increasingly pronounced in 2012 and 2013. Regional and global powers began to align themselves with different factions, turning Syria into a proxy battleground for competing interests. On one side, the Assad regime received significant support from Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. Iran, viewing Syria as a critical ally in its regional strategy, provided financial aid, military advisors, and weapons to the regime. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant group backed by Iran, sent fighters to assist Assad's forces in key battles, including the recapture of the strategic town of Qusair in 2013. Russia, meanwhile, emerged as Assad's most powerful ally on the international stage. In addition to supplying arms and equipment, Moscow shielded the regime from international sanctions and intervention by vetoing UN Security Council resolutions critical of Assad. Russia's support was driven by its strategic interests in the region, including its naval base in Tartus, and its desire to counter Western influence in the Middle East. On the other side, opposition groups received backing from countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. These states provided funding, weapons, and logistical support to various rebel factions, hoping to weaken Assad's regime and shift the regional balance of power. However, the fragmented nature of the opposition and the emergence of extremist groups complicated their efforts, leading to a proliferation of competing factions with differing goals and ideologies. The rise of extremism. As the conflict dragged on, extremist groups began to gain prominence, exploiting the chaos to establish footholds in Syria. Among these groups, Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda affiliate, and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, became particularly influential. Their emergence presented a new challenge for both the opposition and the Assad regime, as their brutal tactics and radical ideologies alienated many Syrians and drew international condemnation. The Assad regime sought to capitalize on the rise of extremism by framing the entire opposition as terrorists. This strategy was aimed at undermining international support for the rebels and justifying the regime's use of force. By 2013, this narrative had begun to gain traction in some quarters, with concerns about the growing influence of extremist groups overshadowing the original goals of the uprising. The chemical weapons controversy. One of the most controversial aspects of the Assad regime's conduct during this period was its alleged use of chemical weapons. Reports of chemical attacks began to surface in 2012, with opposition groups accusing the regime of deploying banned substances against civilian populations. The most notorious incident occurred on August 21, 2013, when a chemical attack in the Ghouta region near Damascus killed hundreds of people, including many children. The international response to the Ghouta attack was swift and severe. The United States and its allies accused the Assad regime of crossing a red line by using chemical weapons, prompting calls for military intervention. However, a diplomatic agreement brokered by Russia averted direct action, with Assad agreeing to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons stockpile under international supervision. While this deal was hailed as a diplomatic success, many critics argued that it allowed Assad to escape accountability and continue his brutal campaign against the opposition. Humanitarian crisis and refugee exodus. By the end of 2013, the human cost of the Syrian conflict was staggering. Tens of thousands of people had been killed, and millions more had been displaced. Cities and towns lay in ruins, and the country's infrastructure was on the brink of collapse. The humanitarian crisis spilled over into neighboring countries as millions of Syrians fled to Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and beyond. The refugee crisis strained resources in host countries and became a global concern, drawing attention to the scale and complexity of the conflict. For Bashar al-Assad, 2012 and 2013 were years of survival and consolidation. Despite mounting opposition and international condemnation, he managed to hold on to power thanks to the loyalty of his military, the support of his allies, and his willingness to employ ruthless tactics. However, the costs of his survival were immense, leaving Syria fractured, devastated, and on the path to further escalation. Part 7, Russian Intervention and the Turning Tide, 2014-2015. By 2014, the Syrian civil war had become a protracted and multifaceted conflict, with Bashar al-Assad's regime facing threats on multiple fronts. Opposition groups, including the Free Syrian Army and various Islamist factions, controlled large swathes of territory. The rise of the Islamic State ISIS added a new dimension to the conflict, as the extremist group carved out a self-proclaimed caliphate across parts of Syria and Iraq. For the Assad regime, the situation was increasingly dire, with significant territorial losses, a crumbling economy, and growing discontent even among its core supporters. However, a game-changing intervention by Russia in late 2015 would alter the trajectory of the war and breathe new life into Assad's embattled regime. The rise of the Islamic State. The Islamic State's rapid expansion in 2014 marked a turning point in the Syrian conflict. After capturing the Iraqi city of Mosul in June, ISIS turned its attention to Syria, seizing control of Raqqa and declaring it the capital of its caliphate. The group's brutal tactics, which included mass executions, slavery, and public displays of violence, shocked the world and drew widespread condemnation. While ISIS posed a significant threat to the Assad regime, it also presented an opportunity. The group's presence allowed the regime to position itself as a bulwark against extremism, framing the war as a fight against terrorism rather than a popular uprising. This narrative resonated with some international actors, complicating efforts to build a unified front against Assad. The struggle for survival. As the war dragged on, the Assad regime struggled to maintain control over its territory. By mid-2015, opposition forces had made significant gains, capturing Idlib province and advancing toward the coastal stronghold of Latakia, a key regime stronghold and the heartland of the Alawite community. The fall of these areas would have dealt a devastating blow to Assad, threatening the survival of his regime. Amid these challenges, cracks began to appear within Assad's core support base. Reports emerged of discontent among Alawite communities, who bore a disproportionate burden of the war. Thousands of Alawite soldiers had been killed in the conflict, leaving their families devastated and resentful. Economic hardships compounded the problem, as sanctions, inflation, and unemployment pushed many Syrians into poverty. Even within the regime's inner circle, there were signs of dissent, with some officials reportedly questioning Assad's ability to lead the country out of its crisis. The call for help. Facing the prospect of collapse, Assad turned to his allies for support. Iran had already been providing significant assistance, including financial aid, weapons, and military advisors. Iranian-backed militias, including Hezbollah, played a crucial role in bolstering the regime's forces on the ground. However, even this support was insufficient to reverse the tide of the war. It was in this context that Assad sought greater assistance from Russia, a long-standing ally of Syria. For years, Russia had supported Assad diplomatically, blocking UN Security Council resolutions and providing military aid. But by 2015, the stakes had risen, and Moscow saw an opportunity to assert its influence in the Middle East while protecting its strategic interests in Syria. Russian military intervention. On September 30, 2015, Russia launched a military intervention in Syria at Assad's formal request. The intervention marked a dramatic escalation of Moscow's involvement in the conflict and signaled a turning point in the regime's fortunes. Russian airstrikes targeted opposition-held areas, including those controlled by moderate rebels, Islamist groups, and ISIS. Although the Kremlin justified its actions as part of the global fight against terrorism, critics argued that the primary goal was to prop up Assad and eliminate his rivals. The impact of Russian intervention was immediate and profound. With Russian air support, the Syrian army and its allied militias launched offensives to reclaim lost territory. Key battles, such as the recapture of Palmyra in March 2016, showcased the effectiveness of this partnership. Russian airstrikes were often indiscriminate, targeting civilian infrastructure, hospitals, and schools, which drew widespread condemnation from human rights organizations and Western governments. Despite this, the intervention achieved its primary objective, stabilizing the Assad regime and preventing its collapse. Geopolitical implications. Russia's intervention in Syria had far-reaching implications for the region and the international community. For Moscow, it was an opportunity to reassert its influence on the global stage, challenge Western dominance in the Middle East, and secure its strategic interests, including its naval base in Tartus and air base in Latakia. For Assad, it was a lifeline that ensured his survival and allowed him to regain the upper hand in the war. The intervention also highlighted the fragmented nature of the international response to the Syrian conflict. While Russia and Iran backed Assad, Western countries and regional powers supported various opposition groups, often with conflicting agendas. The lack of a coordinated strategy against Assad and the rise of ISIS further complicated efforts to resolve the conflict, leaving Syria mired in chaos. Propaganda and public image. Throughout this period, the Assad regime sought to portray itself as a stabilizing force in a country torn apart by extremism and foreign interference. State media highlighted the role of Russian airstrikes in targeting ISIS and framed the regime's military campaigns as efforts to protect civilians from terrorism. This narrative, while effective domestically, failed to gain widespread acceptance internationally, where Assad remained a pariah, accused of war crimes and human rights abuses. Assad's personal image was carefully managed during this time. Public appearances were rare but calculated, showing him as calm, composed, and in control, despite the chaos around him. Interviews with international media outlets allowed him to present his version of events, emphasizing the threat of terrorism and deflecting blame for the conflict onto foreign powers and opposition groups. A regime revived. By the end of 2015, the tide of the war had shifted in Assad's favor. The Russian intervention had not only halted the opposition's advance, but also enabled the regime to regain territory and strengthen its position. For Assad, this was a critical turning point, providing him with a renewed sense of confidence and legitimacy. However, the costs of survival were immense. The war had left Syria in ruins, with entire cities reduced to rubble and millions of people displaced. The humanitarian crisis continued to deepen, and the regime's reliance on foreign allies underscored its weakened state. Despite these challenges, Assad's grip on power remained unbroken, setting the stage for the next phase of the conflict. Part 8, Consolidation through Devastation, 2016-2018. By 2016, Bashar al-Assad's regime, bolstered by the critical intervention of Russian military forces, had managed to reverse many of the losses it had suffered during the early years of the Syrian civil war. With the regime regaining territory and strengthening its position, this period marked a significant phase of consolidation for Assad. However, the costs of these victories were extraordinary. Cities lay in ruins, millions had fled the country, and Assad's reputation as a brutal autocrat solidified globally. The fall of Aleppo, a symbol of Assad's resurgence. One of the most significant events during this period was the recapture of Aleppo, Syria's largest city before the war. Aleppo had been divided between rebel and government forces since 2012, with fierce battles reducing much of the city to rubble. In 2016, with heavy support from Russian air power and Iranian-backed militias, Assad's forces launched a final assault to retake the city. The offensive, which lasted months, was marked by widespread destruction and civilian suffering. Hospitals, schools, and residential neighborhoods were bombed indiscriminately, leading to international condemnation. Reports from human rights organizations documented atrocities committed by pro-Assad forces, including summary executions and forced disappearances. The siege of Aleppo culminated in December 2016, with the regime declaring victory after the last rebel-held districts fell. For Assad, the fall of Aleppo was a major symbolic and strategic victory. It demonstrated the effectiveness of his alliance with Russia and Iran and sent a clear message to opposition forces. The regime was willing to go to any lengths to reclaim its territory. However, the human cost was immense. Thousands of civilians were killed and hundreds of thousands were displaced, many forced into overcrowded camps or left to flee across borders. Russia's expanding role. Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict deepened significantly during this time, cementing its position as Assad's most important ally. Russian airstrikes played a decisive role in key battles, not only against ISIS, but also against opposition forces. The intervention allowed Assad to portray his regime as the legitimate government of Syria, fighting terrorism with international support. Moscow's influence in Syria extended beyond the battlefield. Russian advisors played a crucial role in reorganizing Syria's military and security apparatus, ensuring loyalty to Assad while integrating their strategies with those of the regime. Furthermore, Russia secured long-term agreements to maintain its military presence in Syria, including its naval base in Tartus and an air base in Latakia. These agreements underscored Russia's intention to remain a dominant power in the region. For Assad, the partnership with Russia was both a lifeline and a potential vulnerability. While the intervention saved his regime from collapse, it also highlighted his dependence on foreign powers. Critics argued that Assad had effectively mortgaged Syria's sovereignty to Moscow in exchange for survival. Iran and the sectarian dimension. Alongside Russia, Iran played a critical role in bolstering Assad's position. Iranian-backed militias, including Hezbollah, were instrumental in key battles, providing manpower and expertise. Iran's support was driven by its strategic interests in maintaining a land corridor through Syria to Lebanon, as well as its broader goal of expanding influence in the Middle East. The involvement of Iranian forces and Shia militias added a sectarian dimension to the conflict, exacerbating divisions between Syria's Sunni majority and Alawite-dominated regime. Sunni opposition groups framed the war as a struggle against Iranian expansionism, while Assad relied heavily on sectarian loyalists to maintain control. Iran's role also extended into Syria's economy and infrastructure. Iranian companies secured contracts for reconstruction projects, and Tehran established a foothold in Syria's energy and telecommunication sectors. These moves deepened Syria's economic dependence on Iran, mirroring the dynamic of its relationship with Russia. Humanitarian crisis and the refugee exodus. As the war raged on, the humanitarian crisis reached unprecedented levels. By 2018, over 5.6 million Syrians had fled the country, with millions more internally displaced. Refugee camps in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan were overwhelmed, straining resources and creating political tensions. The regime's military strategy, which included sieges and forced displacements, contributed significantly to the refugee crisis. Cities like Homs, Aleppo, and eastern Ghouta were depopulated as residents fled the relentless bombing and starvation tactics employed by Assad's forces. The regime often framed these displacements as part of reconciliation agreements, but critics describe them as acts of ethnic cleansing designed to reshape Syria's demographic landscape. The international community struggled to respond to the crisis. Humanitarian aid was often blocked or diverted by the regime, leaving millions without access to basic necessities. While some countries opened their borders to refugees, others implemented strict policies to limit their entry, fueling debates over immigration and security. Chemical weapons and global condemnation. The Assad regime's use of chemical weapons remained a contentious and horrifying aspect of the conflict. Despite the 2013 agreement to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, reports of their use continued to surface. In April 2017, a sarin gas attack on the town of Khan Sheikhoun killed over 80 people, including children, drawing widespread international condemnation. In response, the United States launched a missile strike on the Shayrat Air Base, marking its first direct military action against the Assad regime. While the strike was largely symbolic, it underscored the growing frustration with Assad's impunity. Subsequent investigations by international bodies confirmed the regime's responsibility for the attack, further tarnishing Assad's reputation on the global stage. The regime's continued use of chemical weapons demonstrated its willingness to flout international norms in pursuit of its objectives. These attacks, combined with the widespread targeting of civilians, solidified Assad's image as a war criminal and deepened his isolation from much of the international community. Rebuilding a broken state. Despite its military successes, the Assad regime faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding a country devastated by war. Entire cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was decimated, and the economy was in shambles. The regime launched a reconstruction campaign, but the process was fraught with corruption and favoritism. Contracts were awarded to loyalist businessmen and foreign allies, excluding many Syrians who had suffered the most during the conflict. The regime also used reconstruction as a tool of control. Areas that had supported the opposition were often excluded from rebuilding efforts, while resources were concentrated in regime strongholds. This approach deepened divisions within Syrian society and raised questions about the prospects for long-term stability. A regime entrenched. By the end of 2018, Bashar al-Assad's position appeared more secure than at any point since the start of the war. Thanks to the support of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, his forces had regained control of much of the country, including major cities and strategic regions. However, the costs of survival were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, millions displaced, and a country in ruins. For Assad, the victories of this period were not just military, but symbolic. They allowed him to project an image of resilience and defiance, portraying himself as the leader who had weathered the storm and emerged victorious. Yet beneath this facade lay a fractured and fragile state, its future uncertain and its people deeply scarred by years of conflict. Part 9, the Assad regime's survival amid new challenges, 2019-2021. As the Syrian civil war entered its 9th year in 2019, Bashar al-Assad's regime had regained control over large portions of the country, thanks to unwavering support from Russia and Iran. However, the years ahead would prove that the regime's challenges were far from over. While military victories consolidated Assad's power, new and evolving problems emerged: an economic collapse, intensifying international isolation, and growing unrest among a war-weary population. This period also saw a recalibration of the regime's narrative as it sought to frame itself as the only path to Syria's stability and recovery. The regime's military dominance. By 2019, Assad's forces controlled approximately two-thirds of Syria, including major urban centers such as Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. The regime's reconquest of eastern Ghouta and Dara in 2018 marked key milestones in its campaign to quash opposition strongholds. However, large parts of northeastern Syria remained under the control of Kurdish-led forces, while Idlib province in the northwest was dominated by rebel groups, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. Assad's military strategy during this period focused on consolidating control over the remaining pockets of resistance. The battle for Idlib, which began in earnest in 2019, became one of the bloodiest and most drawn-out campaigns of the war. Backed by Russian air power and Iranian militias, the regime launched relentless assaults on Idlib's towns and villages, displacing hundreds of thousands of civilians and causing widespread destruction. The use of airstrikes, barrel bombs, and artillery fire drew international condemnation, with human rights groups accusing the regime of committing war crimes. Despite its military dominance, the regime struggled to reassert effective governance over recaptured areas. In many regions, local populations remained deeply distrustful of Assad's government, which they viewed as corrupt, oppressive, and indifferent to their suffering. This lack of trust hindered efforts to stabilize these areas and fueled sporadic outbreaks of unrest. Economic collapse and humanitarian crisis. The Syrian economy, already battered by years of war, faced an unprecedented collapse during this period. A combination of factors, including widespread corruption, international sanctions, and the COVID-19 pandemic, exacerbated the country's economic woes. By 2020, the Syrian pound had lost much of its value, leading to hyperinflation and skyrocketing prices for basic goods. The cost of living became unbearable for many Syrians, with food, fuel, and medicine in critically short supply. The Caesar Act, a U.S. sanctions law passed in June 2020, further tightened the economic noose around the Assad regime. Targeting individuals and entities involved in human rights abuses and war profiteering, the sanctions severely restricted Syria's access to international markets and foreign aid. The regime blamed these measures for the country's economic hardships, but many observers argued that years of mismanagement and cronyism were the root causes. The economic collapse triggered widespread discontent among Syrians, including those in regime-held areas. Protests erupted in the southern city of Ceuta in 2020, with demonstrators calling for improved living conditions and an end to government corruption. Although the protests were relatively small, they highlighted the growing frustration and desperation of the population. The humanitarian crisis in Syria also worsened during this period. Millions of people remained displaced, living in overcrowded camps with limited access to food, water, and medical care. International aid organizations struggled to provide assistance, as the regime imposed strict controls on aid distribution and used access to humanitarian relief as a tool of political leverage. International isolation and diplomatic maneuvering. While Assad had secured his position militarily, he remained internationally isolated. Western countries continued to condemn his regime for its human rights abuses and war crimes, with many calling for his resignation as a precondition for resolving the conflict. The European Union and the United States maintained their sanctions, and Syria's suspension from the Arab League remained in effect. However, Assad found some opportunities to re-engage with regional and international actors. In 2021, he participated in discussions with the UAE and Egypt, signaling a potential thaw in relations with some Arab states. These efforts were driven in part by shared concerns over Turkish influence in the region and the desire to counterbalance Iran's growing role in Syria. Russia and Iran continued to play pivotal roles in sustaining Assad's regime. Moscow used its veto power at the UN Security Council to block resolutions critical of the regime, while Tehran deepened its economic and military involvement in Syria. This dependence on foreign allies underscored the regime's precarious position and its inability to achieve full sovereignty without external support. The role of propaganda in regime survival. Throughout this period, Assad's regime relied heavily on propaganda to maintain its grip on power. State-controlled media framed the government as the protector of Syria, portraying the opposition as terrorists and foreign agents. The narrative emphasized Assad's role as a stabilizing force, capable of rebuilding the country and restoring order. The regime also sought to normalize its image internationally. It portrayed itself as a bulwark against extremism and terrorism, a narrative that resonated with some countries wary of groups like ISIS. Despite these efforts, Assad remained a deeply controversial figure, with many governments and organizations viewing him as a war criminal. The COVID-19 pandemic. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 added another layer of complexity to Syria's challenges. The regime struggled to contain the virus, as the country's healthcare system had been decimated by years of conflict. Hospitals lacked basic supplies, and testing and vaccination efforts were severely limited. While the government claimed to have implemented measures to combat the pandemic, many accused it of downplaying the severity of the crisis and prioritizing resources for loyalist areas. The pandemic also worsened the economic and humanitarian situation, further straining the regime's ability to govern. For many Syrians, the combination of war, poverty, and the pandemic created a sense of hopelessness, with little prospect for relief. An uncertain future. By the end of 2021, Bashar al-Assad's regime had weathered years of conflict and emerged as the dominant force in Syria. However, the challenges facing the country were immense. The economy was in ruins, the population was deeply divided, and millions remained displaced. While Assad's survival was a testament to his determination and the support of his allies, it came at a staggering cost, a shattered nation and a legacy defined by brutality and repression. As the conflict entered its second decade, questions about Syria's future loomed large. Could the regime rebuild a country devastated by war? Would the international community hold Assad accountable for his actions? And, perhaps most importantly, could the Syrian people ever find a path to peace and reconciliation under his rule? These questions remained unanswered, leaving Syria's fate uncertain. Part 10. The Collapse of the Assad Regime in Exile, 2022-2024. By 2022, Bashar al-Assad's regime appeared to have weathered the worst of the Syrian civil war, with the government regaining control over most of the country. However, this fragile stability masked deep-seated vulnerabilities. Economic collapse, growing dissent, and ongoing international isolation created a volatile environment that set the stage for the regime's eventual downfall. By December 2024, decades of Assad family rule came to an abrupt and dramatic end, culminating in Bashar al-Assad's flight into exile. Mounting economic woes, the Syrian economy remained in a state of freefall, with hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and unemployment reaching unprecedented levels. International sanctions, particularly under the Caesar Act, crippled Syria's ability to engage in global trade or attract foreign investment. Even in regime-held areas, basic goods like food, fuel, and medicine were scarce and prohibitively expensive. Corruption and cronyism exacerbated the economic crisis. The Assad regime continued to prioritize its loyalists and inner circle, enriching a small elite while the majority of Syrians struggled to survive. Reconstruction projects were largely symbolic, benefiting regime-aligned businessmen and foreign allies like Iran and Russia, while war-ravaged areas remained in ruins. The lack of meaningful economic recovery fueled discontent among the population, including within traditionally loyalist communities. In 2023, large-scale protests erupted in Suwaida, a Druze-majority region in southern Syria. Demonstrators initially called for improved living conditions, but quickly escalated their demands to include political reforms and an end to Assad's rule. These protests spread to other parts of Syria, signaling a resurgence of dissent that the regime struggled to contain. Renewed rebel offensive. While the Assad regime maintained control over most of Syria, opposition forces in Idlib and other pockets of resistance had not been entirely defeated. In late 2024, a coalition of rebel groups led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, launched a coordinated offensive to challenge the regime's hold on key territories. This campaign marked the most significant rebel activity in years, catching the regime off guard and exposing weaknesses in its military infrastructure. The offensive began in November 2024, with rebels capturing Aleppo, a strategic city that had been under regime control since 2016. The fall of Aleppo was a major psychological blow to Assad's government, demonstrating that its control was not as secure as it appeared. The rebels continued their advance, seizing territory in Hama and Idlib provinces and encircling regime strongholds. The fall of Damascus. As rebel forces advanced toward the capital, the regime's ability to maintain order unraveled. By early December 2024, Damascus was under siege, with reports of fierce fighting on the outskirts of the city. The regime's military, stretched thin and demoralized, struggled to mount an effective defense. Civilians in the capital faced dire conditions, with food and water supplies running low, and fears of retribution from advancing rebel forces. On December 8, 2024, as rebel troops entered Damascus, Bashar al-Assad fled the city. His departure was shrouded in secrecy, with reports suggesting that he and his family were evacuated to the Russian-operated Khmeimim Air Base near Latakia before being flown to Moscow. The Russian government later confirmed that it had granted Assad political asylum, citing humanitarian grounds. The fall of Damascus marked the end of 54 years of Assad family rule in Syria. Rebel forces declared victory, and celebrations erupted in parts of the country, though the future of Syria remained uncertain. The collapse of the regime left a power vacuum, with various factions vying for control and international actors seeking to influence the outcome. Life in exile. After fleeing to Moscow, Assad remained largely out of the public eye. The Russian government provided him and his family with protection and accommodations, though details about their lives in exile were scarce. Reports suggested that Assad struggled to adjust to his new reality, having gone from the head of a powerful regime to a figure of international infamy. In the months following his departure, Assad attempted to justify his actions and maintain a connection to his supporters in Syria. A statement attributed to him, published on the Syrian presidency's Telegram account, claimed that he had left Damascus to oversee military operations, but was evacuated by Russia when the situation became untenable. This narrative failed to gain traction, as many Syrians celebrated his removal from power. International reactions and legal proceedings. The fall of the Assad regime was met with a mix of relief and skepticism from the international community. Western governments, which had long called for Assad's removal, welcomed the opportunity for a political transition in Syria. However, concerns about instability and the potential for renewed conflict tempered hopes for a peaceful resolution. Efforts to hold Assad accountable for his actions gained momentum after his departure. Human rights organizations and legal experts pushed for international tribunals to investigate allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the use of chemical weapons during his rule. France, which had issued an arrest warrant for Assad in 2023, renewed its calls for prosecution, and other countries followed suit. While Assad remained under Russian protection, his legacy as one of the most repressive and controversial leaders of the 21st century was cemented. The atrocities committed under his rule, including mass killings, torture, and the use of chemical weapons, left an indelible mark on Syria and the world. The aftermath in Syria. The post-Assad era in Syria was marked by uncertainty and fragility. Rebel groups, opposition factions, and Kurdish-led forces competed for power, while international actors sought to shape the country's future. Efforts to rebuild Syria faced immense challenges, from the destruction of infrastructure to the deep divisions within its society. For millions of Syrians, the end of Assad's rule represented a chance for a new beginning. However, the scars of war and decades of authoritarianism would take years, if not decades, to heal. The path to reconciliation and reconstruction was fraught with obstacles, but many Syrians remained hopeful that their country could rise from the ashes of conflict. A legacy of ruin. Bashar al-Assad's legacy is one of devastation and division. His refusal to cede power, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, led to one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. The Syrian civil war claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced millions, and left the country in ruins. While Assad's regime ultimately fell, the consequences of his rule will be felt for generations to come.